I don't want to be alarmist here, but it's pretty
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is a Reacts episode. Industry insiders having frank debates about the latest tech, politics, and business news. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into how current events connect to broader themes and trends that impact your startup, your investments, and your day-to-day operational decisions. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris Saad.
And I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
And on today's show, we're going to continue to discuss overinvestment in AI. Sequoia has released an article talking about a potential bubble forming in AI investment, especially on the infrastructure side. Is it real? What does it mean for your investment portfolio and for your startup? We're also going to talk about Meta censoring conversations about Israel and Palestine. This is, of course, a real hot topic, so we're going to tread carefully, but we will discuss it in detail and not shy away from some of the harder conversation. We're also going to talk about the Supreme Court ruling to effectively make the President of the United States a king and how that might affect the next presidential cycle, especially with Biden sort of shitting the bed in the presidential debate. And then finally, we're going to talk about a meta trend about robotics and AI potentially affecting immigration and immigrant workers in society. All that and much, much more on this week's show. Stay tuned.
Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance with SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
All right, welcome to the show. Now, before we get started into the topics, first we want to talk about the Startup Podcast Pact. If you've been listening to some of our episodes and been getting value, we only ask for one thing in return, which is we ask you to please give us a shout out on your favorite social network, subscribe to us on your favorite podcasting app, and follow us on YouTube. It helps us grow the show, it helps stroke the algorithm's ego, and it helps us help more founders over time. With that, let's get straight into it. Let's talk about topic number one.
Okay, so the first thing that we wanted to discuss today is basically a follow-on, Chris, to a story that we discussed a couple of weeks ago, which is the idea of this AI gold rush being all shovels and no shoveling, meaning there's a huge amount of capex investing into the AI infrastructure, but not a lot of actual gold mining going on, not a lot of revenue happening. And so in the past week, this is becoming a bit more of a, there's a bit more heat around this. There have been a number of reports from Goldman and from Sequoia, and I think there was another one as well, basically questioning the level of investment into AI infrastructure. And so Sequoia did an analysis where they basically said, given the amount of money being spent by big tech and by all of the other venture-funded startups into AI, there would need to be $600 billion in incremental annual revenue in order to justify that investment. And this was actually itself a follow-on to an article that Sequoia published in September last year, where they estimated that was $200 billion. So the amount of investment that has happened since September 2023 means there is now a shortfall of $600 billion of revenue that needs to be made from all of this spending on GPUs and so on. What's really been happening here is that the article talks about the fact that due to Moore's law, GPUs themselves are a depreciating asset. There are faster GPUs coming, and a lot of the power is accruing to big tech. So it's hard to see that with this investment boom, that this amount of revenue will ever be happening. Right? The $600 billion is a huge amount of revenue, and that number is continuing to go up. So that really is a valid question, and it's not clear to me, like I said, and like Amira said last time, Chris, where that revenue is going to come from. What do we think? Do we agree with this? How do we see this playing out?
Yeah, we've been talking about versions of this for a number of weeks on the show, right? Sequoia here is talking about supply shortages subsided, GPU stockpiles are growing, OpenAI has the lion's share of revenue. There is now a $500 billion hole in the market that Apple and Microsoft and Meta will have to generate $10 billion annually to really justify all of this spend. And it's not over. They're just they're doubling down and doubling down. And as we were talking about in the last episode, it's not clear that anyone's actually building any real use cases here, at least no one beyond the top tech companies. I've been saying for quite a few months now, it's not clear to me where the ecosystem plays are in some of these categories, because when the model can generate the application on the fly, well, what's left for the application layer in some cases, in many cases? There's a lot of reasons to be, if not skeptical, at least cautious about this AI boom, in the sense that it's going to be broadly valuable to startups everywhere, in the sense that these tech companies aren't massively over-investing or ahead of the curve, and that NVIDIA's sales, revenue, valuation is potentially overinflated. Now, I'm saying there's an argument to be made about that. I'm not saying I necessarily believe that argument. I think we are at the beginning, very beginning of a massive, massive platform shift that we can't even begin to comprehend. Uber, I think, was not a twinkle in Steve Jobs' eyes when he invented the iPhone. The idea of real-time on-demand marketplaces disrupting logistics globally, I don't think was contemplated in hey, let's build a better internet communicator. All we really have to go on is science fiction. And science fiction from Westworld with Rehoboam through to Terminator 2 through to Her predict massive societal shifts and kind of mind-bending levels of sentience and superintelligence and potentially catastrophic implications, if not just on the economic side, then potentially on the society side and life as we know it side. So, investing ahead of this curve feels like a reasonable thing to do, and investing hard feels like a reasonable thing to do. But it might end up being like fiber, where these companies invested heavily in optical fiber, especially in the US. All of that fiber lay fallow for many, many years. Many companies, including Google, bought it up. And over, decades, that fiber started to come to life and that bandwidth started to get used, but it took a long time. And I think we're dealing in half-lives here, so it's not going to take quite that long, but it's not going to go as fast as everybody thinks either.
I think one of the convincing things for me, Chris, from that Sequoia article, well, I mentioned two things. We've talked about the fiber analogy before, right? And I think it's a valid one. What's interesting is that investment in fiber paid off in the long term for the world, but not for the companies and the investors that actually paid the price. So they're kind of, in a sense, holding the can for the benefits of the future companies and the future innovation that rises from their ashes. So I think that is an interesting point to observe here, right? Who are the chumps who are basically progressing the world at their own expense? But there's another thing that is different from fiber, which I think the article makes a good point. And again, it's Moore's law, right? It's the fact that silicon, in this case GPUs, are rapidly depreciating assets. Unlike fiber, which was basically a physical medium, even when it was being laid back in the 90s, it was capable of carrying a gigabit, 10 gigabits, which was several orders of magnitude more than the bandwidth available at the time. NVIDIA, like you said, is coming out with a new GPU that's 2.5 times more powerful in the current state of the art. So the question is, you do all this investment, but if the reward won't be reaped for another 10 years or something, then you end up with basically these massive stranded assets. And so this isn't really a discussion about, is AI the future or not? This is a discussion of, is all this investment going to lead to a fairly spectacular bubble burst? And, I think that Sequoia article makes a pretty good point that it's fairly likely to do so.
Well, it's all of this investment in these depreciating assets, these GPUs that are becoming obsolete every year. I think that's a reasonable argument, but I think that major tech companies and the procurement officers at these companies would say to you, well, the asset might be depreciating, but the model that we're training on these GPUs is the point. And so the GPU could depreciate to zero and its utility depreciate, but we have the model to monetize and learn from and evolve now. I think it's just too early to tell across the board. There's too much change happening too fast, and we just don't know. Sequoia tends to be pretty clever in their analysis. You can go read Sequoia's article here. It's titled AI's $600 billion question. We'll include it in the show notes. And I think in the short term, they're right. As you said, Yaniv, some people are going to get left holding the bag. And in every major platform shift, in every major bubble, in every major gold rush, there are people who are left holding the bag. The bet that everybody's making is when the music stops, they're going to have a chair. To mix metaphors to hell. You've got to be in it to win it. Yet another metaphor. I, for one, we've talked about Silicon Valley versus Australia or other markets, and we've talked about this idea that Silicon Valley has a lot of bubbles and they pop, and the US has bubbles and they pop, and I would rather be in a country where it's more steady state. I would rather be, for my money, and as entrepreneurs and founders listening to this show, I suspect you would agree, you want to be part of the curve. You want to be part of the enthusiasm and the optimism, and you want to bet on your ability to execute and make your bet, make your claim, participate in the upside, and live with the downside if that happens to be where you land. And so I think it's net good for the tech industry to have this kind of enthusiasm and to participate in it.
Yeah, actually, just to put a fine point on that, Chris, this article is about the overinvestment in AI infrastructure. That's all of the big cloud providers just buying up all the GPUs and making them available. And the article is suggesting that they're probably going to take a big loss on that. But their loss is kind of everyone else's gain, Chris, because what's happening is that AI compute is getting cheaper and cheaper and more available. There was a big supply crunch. There's this saying in economics, right, which is that there is never an undersupply. There's never a supply crunch that is not followed by oversupply, right? Because the economic stimulus of there not being enough of something means everybody goes and gets more of it. And then you end up with an oversupply. So I think we are in that transition phase of going from an undersupply of GPUs to an oversupply. That's coming. And so that's going to be great for every startup that makes use of AI. So as we've talked about in previous episodes, it's like, how do you make use of this wisely? How do you make sure you maintain a customer focus, a customer obsession? You don't get carried away by the shiny object of AI. But no doubt, if you do this right, the current situation for founders is an absolute boon.
Yeah, and maybe just a closing thought on this. It's unclear still, though, that there will be an oversupply here because thanks to exponential curves, the demand to train ever larger, more sophisticated models and to run inference on them, and those models becoming more costly to train and run, may mean they just keep soaking up all of that demand, all of that compute capacity. And so if we're racing towards generalized intelligence, I mean, who the hell knows how many GPUs that will take to train and to run? And I'm always, in these conversations, I'm always thinking about this, and I've never mentioned it before, but I'm thinking about Rehoboam from Westworld. This giant sphere, and God knows, what was below the tip of the iceberg there. And this is the show on HBO, where you could imagine these giant intelligences running by the top 4 or 5 companies that are running the world, like just literally running the world. And like, how many GPUs does that take? I don't know, but it's probably a few more than we have right now. And so I'm excited to see how it plays out. And I think anybody who pretends they can predict it is full of shit. So we'll see what happens. All right, that's our thoughts about overinvestment in AI and a possible bubble. What do you think? Join us in the comments and let's discuss it together. The next subject is a report from Bloomberg, which is that Meta has resolved to pull down posts that mention Zionists and Zionism, especially when they're used in the context of what they believe to be a substitution for Jew or Jewish. They're proposing that this is being used really as anti-Semitism in disguise. Their argument is, hey, this is kind of just an alternative word that is being used to get around claims or charges of anti-Semitism, and they're going to tighten their moderation policies about this. Now, I think on the face of this, and if you look at TechMeme, all of the posts that are responding to this article are all basically enthusiastically in agreement that this is a good idea. And, just to give the audience context, they may have not heard all of our back catalog. You have an Israeli background. I have a Palestinian background. We both grew up in Australia. I was born in Australia. We had a very frank discussion about the whole conflict many episodes ago. That wasn't actually intended to be an episode. It was just a conversation between us that got accidentally recorded, literally, and we published it. I think we're both great friends, and there are many, many examples of Jews and Arabs who are great friends. And so this is really not about that. I think the other bit of context here is, it's worth me saying specifically, since I am not the Jew in the conversation, is that anti-Semitism is real and is disgusting and is intolerable and has led to some of the worst atrocities in the history of mankind. But what I think is also true is that some proportion of claims of anti-Semitism are false. Some proportion of them. And that claim has been weaponized to end debate and to silence debate and dissent. And so I think it's important to point out that this decision by Meta is in a broader context of claims against Meta that they are in fact silencing debate about the Israel-Palestine conflict. And these are claims from Human Rights Watch and from other very reputable outlets that are saying either as official acts by Meta or in some cases as unofficial acts by employees at Meta, anti-Israeli or pro-Palestinian voices are being subdued, suppressed, minimized, shadow banned, pick your language. It's a real phenomena that some have observed, including employees who've left and sued Meta for this going on. And so I think I just want to put in context using Zionism as a proxy for Jew or Jewish hate, and anti-Semitism is obviously not appropriate, but I worry about the broader theme of Meta dampening or softening or suppressing legitimate political debate in this sphere, and which actually I have seen myself anecdotally, just to go beyond the headlines. I think it's destructive and divisive and concerning for general free speech everywhere.
Okay, let me get a bit personal for a moment here. So I've led a pretty charmed life. You know, I've heard about anti-Semitism and all the experiences people have, and I've been some combination of lucky and maybe oblivious and never really experienced much or any of it personally. Since October 7, I have never been so aware of its reality. And if you go onto a platform that doesn't do perhaps what Meta is proposing to do or already doing, such as Twitter, it is pretty horrific what you see on there. You know, the absolutely bald-faced, you know, Nazi-aligned propaganda and opinions that are being freely shared and reshared and liked on there. I'm like, oh, damn, this shit is real. There really are people who think this stuff. And yes, if I go onto Twitter, I'd say 9 times out of 10, the word Zionist is not some discussion of a sort of socio-political philosophy. It is a way of basically saying Jews bad. And so I have a lot of sympathy or empathy for Meta and the position they're in, because what's happened here is that, yes, it is possible to have a proper, meaningful political debate and discussion, as you say, Chris, and to criticize Zionism as part of that, but the term has been weaponized. And when a term like that gets weaponized, then you have a problem. And, you know, it's funny, just to sort of draw maybe what's a bit of a funny analogy, but I think it's relevant, right? Like, again, growing up not in the USA, this whole idea of you can't wear blackface, I never understood that, right? Because I'm like, what if I'm going to a costume party and I'm a huge fan of, I don't know, Eddie Murphy. So I want to dress up as Eddie Murphy. And Eddie Murphy happens to have a certain skin tone that doesn't match mine. So why can't I put some color on my face so that I look more like him? Because the whole point of dressing up is to look like someone. There is no act of hate there. It's an act of admiration. And then I guess I learned over time that the problem is that blackface, the act of making your skin darker like that, was weaponized for a long time as a racist trope. And so even though it's not fair and it's a bit silly, you just don't get to do that. And unfortunately, what seems to be happening with the term Zionism is not dissimilar to that. So my issue, Chris, is that I agree it would be nice to have reasonable debates on Israel-Palestine, but I just don't see many of them happening. It's become a sort of another just weapon in the sort of culture wars, and I see no meaningful debate, just inflammatory yelling across the trench. So I've kind of opted out of most of this stuff, to be honest.
Yeah, I must say, actually, also, prior to October 7th, I have also been fairly charmed and oblivious to any sort of racism against me for having a Middle Eastern heritage, maybe being confused for Muslim, although I'm not. I'm an atheist and was raised Christian, and kind of obliviously proud of and enthusiastic about and believed in kind of the global rules-based system. And since October 7th, I've also kind of had the scales taken from my eyes, if you will. It feels like the double standards are so obvious. Just simple word choices like killed versus murdered or defend versus attack. What is covered, for example, there are so many things, atrocities covered by Israeli media that are not covered by Western media, that what's chosen to be covered and not covered. Rules-based systems from the UN, resolutions ignored and courts derided. This has become so real and so visceral and so heartbreaking, and it just kind of has completely shifted my worldview. I also, as you said, have a lot of sympathy for Meta. You know, we've had whole episodes where I'm the lone wolf defending Meta's difficult job of moderating its scale. And very few people agree with me. I'm just like, You try moderating a massive billion-person community and getting it right every time, and I just think it's an impossible job to do well and without upsetting everybody.
Yeah.
Are there people using Zionism as a proxy for Jewish? Sure. But I think it is a legitimate debate and a legitimate concept to engage with Zionist extremism the same way as it is to deal with Muslim extremism, the same way it would be to deal with right-wing extremism and left-wing extremism in the US. I think these are important concepts that are causing a lot of pain and suffering, and in the extreme are dangerous and destructive. That conversation, you said it's nice to have. Yes, sure, it'd be nice to have reasonable debates about this. No, I would say it's essential to have reasonable debates about
Yeah,
this.
but they're not happening. That's my point.
They're not happening, but I can't imagine a world where it would be okay to ban using terrorism as a proxy for Muslims or Muslim extremists as a proxy for Muslim or...
I actually do. Imagine, because this is sort of what's happening. Imagine a world where the Muslim community in a Western country gets referred to as terrorists.
I mean, that was the world for a long time after 9/11 and still to this day in large swaths of America and other places. I mean, that's still the world.
Yeah, and that's unacceptable. And I'm fully supportive of any kind of censorship on social media of that conflation.
But that's the point I'm making, is that there isn't any. There is no way to talk about Zionist extremism without saying the word Zionism. And therefore, to make that a watchword that is, let's say, difficult to use or a subject of increased scrutiny has a chilling effect.
It does. It does. And again, there is a cost to this. There is a cost to this.
A real cost.
Let me make 2 points. So one is that, again, on Twitter, where the censorship doesn't happen, 99 times out of 100, when I see the word Zionist, it is not used to discuss the land grabs being performed by Zionist extremists in the West Bank. No, it's being used to refer to either Jews in general or in particular Jews who support the ongoing existence of a Jewish state of Israel. So that's the context in which this is happening, right? And then the other thing is, what I'm seeing here is just an increase in tribalism from the types of discussion that are happening on social media. And I heard this term a few weeks ago called October 7 Zionists, and that refers to Jewish people who were not particularly, who didn't, outside of Israel, who didn't particularly care much about the existence of Israel, didn't think much about the existence of Israel, were, maybe quite critical of many of the policies around the state of Israel. But then once they saw, I guess, the global reaction and the campus protests and the anti-Semitism on X and all of that, they suddenly felt actually polarized towards Israel and more willing to kind of overlook the many transgressions that have happened and continue to happen and say, the most important thing here is that this country survives. And so I feel the pull of that. Like, before October 7, I would have been focusing on the fact that Netanyahu is a horrible war criminal and that what's been happening in the West Bank is terrible and has been terrible for decades. After October 7, when I see the types of debates, the types of political positions lacking nuance taken by parties that I've previously voted for, I'm like, damn, I gotta, I'm not gonna stand by while people say that Israel shouldn't exist. And so my issue here is there are no constructive debates happening, that there has been this whole milieu has just turned everyone into a tribalist where you pick a side and generally it's your side, whatever your side happens to be based on your ancestry or anything like that. And I hate that that's happened to all of us. So yeah, I kind of feel there's healthy debate and there's unhealthy debate.
This is a tech show, and really the main point of bringing this up is about the tech and about the difficulties of managing platforms at scale or participating in the ecosystems in which these platforms affect, right? What I'm really wanting to point to, though, is there's no debate that using Zionist or Zionism as a proxy for Jew or Jewish and as a cover for anti-Semitism is bad, period, full stop. That's an obvious statement to make. The thing that I'm most interested in, though, is that this is part of a broader pattern of meta to actually suppress this kind of debate and content in general.
Yep.
And again, I'll just give you some very simple examples. On Instagram, I look at a couple of kid videos, about children, because my wife sends me cute kid videos, or she sends me some funny relationship memes, or I look up furniture for an apartment that I'm furnishing once, and my Instagram is flooded with kid videos, relationship videos, and furniture videos. I can tell you my wife has sent me more than one video about Palestine and Israel. She's completely heartbroken and transfixed by it. And my feed and hers has exactly zero content about Israel and Palestine algorithmically recommended to her. And in fact, the opposite. Some channels that she follows are not shown in her feed.
Mm.
I'm saying this, you call it a conspiracy theory, call it what you will. There are articles from major institutions and employees who are claiming this is a real phenomena. And there are other articles, again, from legitimate institutions, I won't go through them all now, claiming that actually that the TikTok banning phenomena is related to this, is that the TikTok is not engaged in this kind of moderation, and that's a reason why people are looking at it twice. That is a massive problem if there is, because again, I'm a defender of Meta. I'm a defender of my Jewish and Israeli friends. I'm a defender of free speech, well curated and well moderated. But this just feels, anecdotally and through the official reports from official human rights watchers, it feels like there's something else going on, and it's not good for our conversation.
I'm not sure I agree. And I think this is sort of the point. The fact that the two of us, who I think basically have similar politics, similar backgrounds, similar everything, different ancestry, find ourselves viewing this situation so differently, I think is highlighting the problem. And I don't think getting everyone's feed full of polarizing content on this is going to help anything.
But I don't think we actually do disagree, though. We might even agree that filling our feeds with it is not helpful. But I mean, I don't know that I want Meta making that decision, right?
But then go to Twitter. I mean, I guess that's sort of the point, right? That there is
No, but we don't
moderation. Moderation is an editorial choice by definition.
Yeah, but I don't think Meta is like saying, well, geez, the polarization in the US about left versus right is really not helpful, so we're going to suppress arguments between Republicans and Democrats. I mean, I don't think it's for them to decide that certain conversations are helpful or not helpful, right? I mean, that feels like overstepping the mark.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question about moderation. And that goes back to some of the debates we've had before, Chris, which is like, okay, moderation is editorial, right? There is no line where you say, this is unacceptable hate speech and this is like totally reasonable debate. It is a continuum with lots of shades of gray. And so by definition...
But we're not talking about the kind of conversation. What I'm describing here is not the kind of conversation. I'm talking about the category or topic. So they're not, as far as I can tell from these articles, again, from Human Rights Watch and employees, former employees who are literally suing Facebook for this, and they're whistleblowers, they're not saying, hey, the moderation is too heavy-handed. They're saying the entire topic is being suppressed. That is an editorial step much further beyond like, hey, you can't yell fire in a theater or you can't violate some community standard. In any case, I suggest people check out the article, make their own decisions about it, and other articles related to Meta and their moderation or softening of the algorithmic amplification of this topic. It feels to me like, again, as someone who's defended Meta and the difficulty of moderating its scale, it feels like this is a good case study and something for tech founders, tech entrepreneurs, and all of us in the tech industry to have a think about. It feels like something we haven't got right yet.
I just wanted to make one final point, though, or reinforce a point that I've made, which is I have never seen another issue in which one's political position is so dictated by one's background. And that means that it's devolved into pure tribalism. And that makes me really sad. And so, to me, it just doesn't feel like a safe topic, right? And I do think that it makes it a bit of a special topic just because of that. It's like, I can predict with near 100% accuracy what someone's position is going to be on this. You tell me their name. I include myself in this. I don't feel good about it.
I think that's mostly true, but not absolutely true. There are a lot of people on both sides calling for a peaceful, long-term solution and don't believe that the current situation is...
I don't believe that's the sort of conversation that's being suppressed, though, Chris.
I've not had a single algorithmically recommended story about this topic on Facebook, period. If I post something about it on Facebook, the engagement is 0. And if I post a follow-up post saying, hey, look at my previous post, it gets a lot of engagement and people go, oh, I didn't see that. I mean, this is just pure anecdotal. Obviously, it's not scientific. But if it wasn't bolstered by many articles from official sources saying, hey, this is weird, I wouldn't bring it up. And so it is weird. That's for sure. All right. As always, that's a very contentious topic. Those are our thoughts. What do you guys think? Join us in the comments. We'll join you down there. Let's discuss and debate it there. Please keep it civil because we're only looking for constructive conversation.
Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, FlowHealth, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
Let's move on to even more politics.
Ooh.
We're giving up all appearances. This is a technology show this week. This one is really pure politics, but of course, politics affects the ecosystems, countries, and communities we live in. And I think this is sufficiently important, Yaniv, that we bring it up and discuss it. Silicon Valley is in the US, and the US is being buffeted by some extreme political machinations at the moment. The Supreme Court recently ruled that a president is essentially immune from prosecution for their acts during their presidency. Now, there's more subtlety to this. They claim that it's only about presidential acts that are immune. However, I watched this long video by a very pragmatic legal analyst who kind of breaks down law and legal interpretation. And his assessment was, and he was citing others who are even more learned and senior than he, that this is really a fairly blanket immunity for presidential acts, because the core of what is a presidential act is barely defined, actually not really defined, except that it includes the military. So almost by definition, using the military in any way, shape, or form is immune. So you could use SEAL Team 6 to murder your political rivals. All the way to the outer limits of this, where there are these gray boundaries where immunity should be presumed unless otherwise proven. And so really, for all intents and purposes, for all functional purposes, the president is now a bubble outside of or immune from US law. And this is really the dissent to this for the minority, who are the Democrats really, or the liberals on the court, is scathing. I mean, it is just like a dissertation on like bad decisions. And it's been cited as really one of the top 2 or 3 or 5 bad decisions in the court. I'd put Citizens United up there as well. So this is, I mean, I think without hyperbole and without, I don't want to be alarmist here, but it's pretty catastrophic. And when you combine this with Biden's, as far as I know, as far as recent memory goes, the worst debate performance in the history of modern American politics, where he just came across as a completely senile, feckless, useless old man. And that has massively impacted his popularity ratings. And now the Democrats are really trying to get him out. So now the whole party is fractured and they have really a lame duck running here. I don't know about your politics. People listening here will have different politics, but it shouldn't really matter what your politics are. You really shouldn't want the president to be king. And if you are a liberal or feel like Trump has strongman tendencies, I think you should be really quite concerned. At least I am. What do you make of this, Yaniv?
I'm less certain than you. I mean, I'm not a constitutional scholar of the US Constitution or anything like that. I actually think that the headline doesn't bother me, right? The headline is, if you're the president and you are in charge of the most powerful military in the world and the most powerful economy in the world, you need to make decisions that are very consequential all the time and that will have the potential to do a lot of harm. As long as you're doing that as part of your job as being president, you shouldn't be able to be hounded and prosecuted for that later. I'm like, that makes sense to me. I've got to be honest, right? So then the question becomes, well, okay, is the way this is phrased and whatever, does that mean the immunity is granted beyond that? Like, that question of, can you use the military to assassinate a political rival because you're the commander-in-chief? Yes, you're the commander-in-chief, but no, that is not an act of the presidency because you're not acting in your capacity as the president of the country. So yeah, it's a question, I guess, of like, how hard does it become to bring a prosecution and so on? How easy is it to delineate between official acts and unofficial acts as a private individual? Because like I said, I do think that you should be immune for official acts. So I guess my answer is this, I don't know. Like, the president shouldn't be above the law. That is clear. I don't know if this makes a president above the law. Don't know.
Well, again, the way the decision has been drafted, it is extremely broadly drawn and gives the president basically the benefit of the doubt when acting on the organs of his direct power, of his unique power. So if he is using his unique power, and they specifically list 2 or 3 of these powers, and one of them is the power of the military, nowhere else, by the way, are the president's unique powers explicitly listed. And so that's a bit of a shit show in its own right. The decision, the ruling basically says, by definition, manipulating the organs of his direct power, i.e. the military, that it is a presidential act. And that he is essentially given full immunity about that. And anything on the bubble, he is given presumed immunity. I mean, it cannot be more strongly and broadly worded as far as the analysis goes. I'm not a constitutional scholar, I'm not a lawyer, but I know that the idea is that the president is absolutely subject to the law and that his acts as president should absolutely be scrutinized not just by the law, but by the other branches of government. Right? The whole point of the US Constitution and governance model is that no one can be trusted with power. And so that there is this perfect circle of checks and balances. And that actually the presidential branch, the executive, was designed to be the weakest of the branches because of this ability to accrue power to an individual. That is just fundamentally not true. You don't need to be a scholar to understand that. It is not true anymore. And I just don't know where this leaves the US. And if you think of the US as District 1 in the Hunger Games, the rest of the world. I think it's terrifying. You put the wrong man or woman in that seat, you're going to be spending a long time chasing them around, trying to prove that they've defied this ruling and broken what little law they have left governing them. And by the time you're done, I don't know that the courts will be left and that the political rivals will be left because you're too busy squabbling about what immunity really means.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll see. Yeah, I don't feel great about it. I don't feel great about it.
You say that so casually. I guess we'll see if it's the end of democracy and the Western world order as we know it.
Well, there's plenty of threats to democracy in the Western world order. This is one of those threats.
Okay, Yaniv, well, that's our thoughts on the topic. What do you guys think about the ruling from the Supreme Court? Does the president become king? Are they above the law? Is this really a catastrophic thing, or maybe I'm just exaggerating? Let us know what you think, and let us know what you think about what might happen in the next presidential election. All right, the last and hope maybe least controversial, but it's still going to be a little controversial topics we want to talk about, was also political, but more directly connected to AI, robotics, and labor markets and the economy. Yaniv, you had this meta trend you wanted to talk about. We do this every now and then on the show. One of us observes this kind of like meta trend, and we want to share it with the audience and get people to send us some feedback. You've identified something to do with immigration and robotics, so set it up for us and let's dive in.
It's a sort of a thought exercise, of forecasting thought exercise, Chris. So we've just had two very fractious elections in the UK and France. We obviously have the US election coming up. What has been happening, especially in Europe and the US, is this greater and greater focus on immigration, right? And I think what you would say, and I guess what I'd say is I'm not taking a political position here. I'm making a political observation that there are more and more people in countries that are large immigrant destinations who are becoming uncomfortable with the level of immigration, with the fact that they feel, let's say, less at home in their home country than perhaps they used to. And this is affecting politics in a major way. Now, if you really think about immigration, it comes into three buckets, Chris, right? There is high-skilled migration, which is about saying we want to import the best and the brightest to help grow our economy and make our country more powerful. There is humanitarian immigration, which is basically refugees saying, we have a responsibility to take in people who have had difficult lives. And then there is low-skilled immigration. And it's the low-skilled immigration that I wanted to talk about, really. Low-skilled immigration is basically saying, this has been true since, say, mid-last century, where wealthy Western countries have had labor shortages, and they have solved those labor shortages by bringing in immigrants, right? And that trend is not changing. In fact, we continue to have declining birth rates in basically every developed economy, and that means that labor shortages become an ongoing issue, right? And I think there's been this interesting thing, right, where for quite a long time, I think if you polled the population, they would say, there is too much immigration. We're not anti-immigrant, we would like a bit less immigration. But then the government, whichever government is in power from both sides of politics, will always allow in a lot of immigrants because it is so important to keep the economy going, right? And there's this weird tension between the government and the people who voted them in. What I am seeing is a potential for a shift in that dynamic, where with the increasing power and affordability of automation solutions, including in the physical world, so I'm talking about robotics in the broad sense, the ability for fewer people to get more stuff done, I feel like this nexus between economic growth and migration in low birth rate countries is kind of broken. And so what I'm expecting to see over the next decade or two is a lot more governments really standing on a platform of, but then actually enacting low immigration rates. And I think that's going to be a pretty seismic shift in, the way the world works, and will have other weird second order effects. But I just wanted to put that out there and, for debate and for steel manning, because I think it's an interesting thing that's coming that I just haven't seen discussed at all.
Yeah, you're right. I haven't seen anybody talk about this. To my mind, it's a really interesting additional vector of society level disruption that is possible despite any kind of alignment, AI safety nonsense, because this is not a bug, it's a feature, right? AI replaces cognitive labor and large swaths of white collar work, and embodied AI, robotics, will replace large forms of blue collar labor and low skilled labor, as you've mentioned. Not only will that put a bunch of people out of work who are citizens or immigrants of a country, existing immigrants of a country, it's going to put a lot of pressure on immigration policy and intake. You're 100% right. Yeah, I don't know what to say about it except to say this is just one of the many ways that there's going to be a kind of society level shocks, supply shocks, demand shocks, culture shocks. Now, let's maybe talk about some other flow-on effects from that. So why do people immigrate? They immigrate for opportunity. Well, if a country is experiencing a cratering of their economy because of automation and AI, I mean, there's maybe less opportunity in the US, for example, to immigrate to. So maybe they don't want to immigrate, right? There isn't any opportunity there to immigrate to. Maybe there is an increase in abundance. So services, food, labor becomes cheaper in the home country, in the origin country. And so those who may be low skilled, lower on the socioeconomic totem pole, have less reason to immigrate because their homes are actually, there are more services at lower costs, but still they don't have a job. And so, who's going to pay for these services if they don't even have any job of their own? And so it's hard to predict, does immigration even need to continue because there isn't that kind of unbalanced economic opportunity? Maybe these rich companies are the first to adopt AI, and so the opportunity diminishes or evaporates in rich countries, but third world or up-and-coming emerging economies are not able to adopt AI as quickly, so there's more labor needed there. It's tough to see how the sloshing of the bucket, right? If you think of the world as this like giant bucket of labor and money and resources and wealth is sloshing around, right? And it's hard to see where the new water level is and where the water settles, because there's so many interacting systems and subsystems and human psychology involved. But yeah, this is I think a great point to make, and it intersects with even the political rhetoric in the US about immigration and building a wall and all this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, it's going to change the dynamic dramatically.
I think it's just maybe one of the many second order effects, right? When we talk about second order effects, when you have like a social change, that's the main first order effect. We say, well, robotics. But then all the second order effects are what things happen because we now have widespread robotics. And I think this is one of them that will be really interesting to see. And I think it's also a little bit of a dangerous one, Chris, because it further sort of silos the world. So we'll see what happens.
There is this kind of meta trend happening of this balkanization of countries. We're all withdrawing into our nation states. And then there is this balkanization of people. We're all withdrawing into our own algorithms and our own tribes. I've mentioned on the show many times, I wrote this think piece some 10 years ago about what I called unbundling and this hyper-personalization at runtime. At the time and now, I wasn't judging it to be good or bad, just an observation. But it's clear there have been negative externalities, and right now I can't imagine seeing it getting better in the short term. And so, yeah, it's definitely an acceleration of this kind of unbundling. These countries will draw into themselves, and we'll see what happens. All right, that's our thoughts on how robotics and AI might affect immigration. What do you think? Will it disrupt immigration policy? Will it have no effect? Or will emerging economies actually become more interesting, and might less immigration actually occur? Join us in the comments and we'll join you down there. All right, how can people find you on the internet to get some more amazing insights like this?
Find me on LinkedIn. I happily accept connection requests from TSP fans. Just identify yourselves in the invite and I'd be happy to be connected, and I try to make it a bit of a less boring place. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, give me a follow there, or all the social media at Chris Saad, or find me at chrissaad.com/newsletter, where you can subscribe to my newsletter directly there. All right, Yaniv, a fun, extra political episode today. I'm sure we'll get some comments about all of these topics. So we look forward to engaging with you down in the comments on YouTube. And apparently Spotify is turning comments on too. So if and when we can do that, we'll turn those on and join you in those comments as well.
Okay, that was a fun one, Chris.
All right, guys, until next time, bye-bye.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
Good luck making us sound smart. Bye.